And it's going to be about this war with China that our major newspapers in Australia were trying to talk us into last week. And that underscores the importance of this protest rally on Saturday. It is part of an anti-war movement that we must build in this country. And my comment on the slogan is, it reminds me of what Julian Assange says was his motivation in establishing WikiLeaks: wars are started on lies, peace can be achieved through truth. Right? So let's just single out one of the lies in the case of the Iraq War, because he's bobbed up again. Peter Jennings was the defence official, or the government official, the advisor to John Howard, then Prime Minister, who explicitly advised John Howard that Australia should join the war in Iraq, and on the basis of all the lies at the time, weapons of mass destruction, etc. So he is known as one of the explicit advisors to go to war, of course, and that advice was followed. Since then, in the 20 years since then, he has made a bigger name for himself as the long-time executive director of the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, ASPI, which you call
the American Subversive Propaganda Institute.
And you call it that because it's funded by, even though the majority of its funding comes from the Australian Defence Department, it receives an enormous amount of extra funding from the US State Department, which is its biggest foreign funder, but also the British government, the Dutch government, the Japanese government, and then a host of weapons manufacturers. And more than any other institution in Australia, under Peter Jennings, this became the propaganda agency to talk us into hating and feeling the need to go to war on China. Would you agree?
I agree. And in their report to Parliament a couple of years ago on the dispensing of their budget, they actually admitted in their report that the majority of the funding received from the armaments manufacturers and from the US was directed towards research projects aimed at China.
Last week, the Sydney Morning Herald and the Age newspapers shocked Australia and much of the world, frankly, with these very dramatic headlines, front page screaming headlines, red alert, showing images, we'll put it on the screen, of jets coming out of China, flying to Australia, that we are facing a threat from China, right? As if the jets had already left the tarmac, John. That's the urgency with which this was reported. And all it was a particularly nasty, xenophobic journalist at the Sydney Morning Herald, their international editor Peter Harcher, who we have long identified in the top 5 of the most vicious xenophobes in Australia. And I'm sorry, I'm not holding back describing his character because he doesn't have any. This guy is the worst of the worst of an already pretty bad bunch in the Australian media. Peter Harcher assembled a panel of 5 supposed experts, led by this same Peter Jennings, to assess the threat to Australia from China. And of course, given that it was led by Peter Jennings and 2 of the 5 were also associated with ASPI, it confirmed, yes, China is this immediate threat to us. It predicted war with China in the next 3 years. And even the Murdoch Sky News was taken aback by that, because they reminded people how in 2020 Peter Jennings was predicting war with China within 3 months, right? So he's long been known for this.
Well, he extended the time frame a little.
That's right. But he's extended the time frame entirely in keeping with what American analysts are predicting about this. And so suddenly you've got this, you and I have long talked about this, that just the propagandizing for war, and it just went way over the top last week.
We went ballistic to
the point where the former Prime Minister of Australia, Paul Keating, who is already very outspoken on this, he took direct aim at Peter Harcher and the Sydney Morning Herald and the Age, and he didn't hold back, right, at the role that he called them warmongers. He said this is the worst kind of war propaganda he's seen for 50 years.
Yes.
Unlike present players, you haven't received a military briefing on this issue since the mid-90s. Could you be out of touch on this issue? And given you didn't foresee the military build-up from China, as well as intimidation of neighbouring countries when you were in office, what makes you so sure China isn't a military threat to Australia?
Because I've got a brain, principally, and I can think, and I can read, and I read every day, I mean, why would China want us threatened? What would be the point? They get the iron ore, the coal, the wheat. What would be the point of China wanting to occupy Sydney and Melbourne militarily? And could they ever do it? You don't need a briefing from the dopey security agencies we have in Canberra to tell you that. I know you're trying to ask a question, but the question is so dumb it's hardly worth an answer.
Well, so do you just let them carry on with their business, whether that be in the Spratly Islands or wherever, you just say, oh, well, they don't plan to attack Australia, so it's all okay?
Just go on to Google Maps and have a look at it. It's about as big as Centennial Park. about a larger centennial park in Sydney. That's what we're talking about. Sky News, you got to dust up your reputation beyond Sky News, and you're probably doing your best to do that.
Right, and you've been around that same time. Would you
I would
agree
absolutely
with his
Paul
statement?
Keating. I mean, I don't think I've ever seen war propaganda in Australia of that ilk. We've seen it in other places. We've mentioned the fact that Peter Jennings has extended the time frame a little bit, but that is also in America's interest because we have to have time to spend vast amounts of the Australian budget on American armaments before any such conflict would begin. But the time frame for the conflict is entirely an American construct, and I think this is the first lie.
Julian Assange, war has started on lies, right? We were lied into the Iraq War, and you would say, and I would agree, we're being lied to again to get us into another war. So let's go through the specific lies and in detail one by one.
Could I make the point that you mentioned that Peter Jennings convinced John Howard to go to war in Iraq? When it became apparent that it was based on a lie, John Howard made the excuse that nevertheless we had to go to war in Iraq alongside America to preserve our alliance with America. And this is also the same argument today, that the conviction that Australia must inevitably be involved in any United States conflict against China is based on this notion that the alliance with America is all important and must never be weakened, and that if we took a distinct and different position from the United States with regard to China, that would undermine our precious alliance with the United States. But the prospect of a war with China is in fact based on quite a large set of lies. The first of these, of course, is that China is a military threat to Australia. China has never, in any policy document that I've ever seen, ever stated that Australia is an enemy, has never stated that China is planning to go to war against Australia. The Chinese military build-up is given as an example of China's mounting aggression, whereas it is clearly, whilst it's reaching a point where it is comparable to the United States in terms of its capability, it is completely different from the United States in terms of its posture. The Chinese defence policy is explicitly focused on the defence of the territorial integrity of China. It has very little in the way of expeditionary forces, and even the United States very proudly boasts that it has positioned itself in such a way that China cannot, in fact, conduct any expeditionary operations outside of its own immediate neighbourhood. So, whereas the United States military power is, and has been for many, many years, explicitly expeditionary. It is to conduct operations far from the United States mainland in the so-called defence or the promotion of the United States position as number one in the world. And that is the first fact that I think needs to be remembered in any analysis, or in my analysis of what is happening. The first and most important fact is that the United States has basically sworn to do everything in its power, including using war, to maintain its position as the number one supreme power in the world.
And that's the Wolfowitz doctrine. It will not tolerate a rival.
That's right. We will not permit. We will not permit any nation or grouping of nations to challenge the United States' position as the supreme power in the world. They describe themselves as the indispensable nation. The implication of that is, of course, that all other nations on the planet are dispensable, and that includes Australia.
In some ways, it covers most of the bad aspects of the aerial war in Iraq and what we must be able to infer is going on in Afghanistan. These are not bad apples. This is standard practice. You can hear it from the tones of the voices of the pilots that this is in fact another day at the office. These pilots have evidently, and gunners have evidently become so corrupted, morally corrupted by the war, that they are looking for excuses to kill.